There is a version of this story almost everyone knows, and nearly none of it comes from where the story actually began. The unbreakable body. The one weak spot on the heel. Even that ending was invented by a Roman poet writing 800 years after the original poem. In the earliest telling, this man had no magic protection at all. He could bleed. He could be hurt. He chose this path anyway, before he was even old enough to grow a beard. And at the very end of his own story, from the one place fame can't follow a person, he said something no legend is supposed to admit, that he'd trade every scrap of his immortal name just to be an ordinary, forgotten nobody for one more day of being alive. To understand that confession, you have to start at a wedding that had nothing to do with war. His mother was a sea goddess so striking that two of the most powerful gods alive both wanted to marry her, until a prophecy warned that her son would grow stronger than his own father. For a king of the gods, that was a threat to the throne itself. So she was quietly married off to a mortal instead, and she never forgave the downgrade. At that wedding, an uninvited guest threw a golden apple into the crowd, setting off a rivalry among the gods that would years later ignite the very war that killed her son. That war began at his parents' wedding, before he was even born. She knew from the start he had exactly two possible futures, a long, quiet life nobody would remember, or a short, blazing one people would still repeat 3,000 years later. Glory or longevity, never both. He trained under a wise centaur in the mountains, learning combat, medicine, and music together, and by his teenage years was already the most dangerous person on the Greek mainland. Beside him grew a boy with no divine blood and no prophecy of his own, sent to the same household after an accident back home. The two became inseparable, in a way that would shape everything after. When the call came to raise an army for a war overseas, his mother made one last attempt to change his fate, disguising him among a king's daughters on a distant island. It didn't last. A Greek envoy arrived in disguise, laid out gifts of jewelry and cloth for the princesses, and mixed in among them a shield and a spear, then had someone sound a war horn outside. Every princess fled the noise. One of them reached for the weapon instead. He'd made his choice before anyone even asked. The fleet sailed after a commander gave up his own daughter to secure fair winds, a cost paid before a single enemy ship was even sighted. For 9 years, the siege outside those city walls went nowhere. He spent the time building his reputation and claiming his share of the spoils, the way commanders on both sides did in that era. It was the 10th year everything came apart, not from the enemy, but from his own side. The overall commander had taken a prize of his own, provoked a god's retaliation against the whole camp, and when forced to give her back, seized our warrior's own prize in return, purely to prove who was in charge. It nearly turned violent in the command tent itself. Instead, he pulled his entire fighting force out of the war and asked his mother to make sure the Greeks suffered without him. He didn't just want to be missed. He wanted his commander humiliated. His closest friends sat there and watched the whole decision unfold. Without him, the Greeks began losing badly, pushed back to their burning ships. An enormous peace offer arrived at his tent, his prize returned, mountains of gold, entire cities. He didn't move. A different appeal about the friends dying without him landed harder. He agreed to rejoin only once the enemy reached his own ships, not before. Then his closest friend came to him in tears, begging to wear his armor into battle so the enemy would think their fiercest opponent had returned. He agreed on one condition: push them back, then stop. Do not go near the city walls. Come home. He prayed for 2 things that day: his friend's success and his friend's safe return. Only the first was granted. His friend, mistaken for the real thing, turned the entire battle, then did exactly what he'd been told not to do, pushing all the way to the walls. A god struck him from behind, a soldier wounded him further, and an enemy prince delivered what should have been an ordinary death, except it took a god, a spearman, and a prince together to bring down one man wearing borrowed armor. That's how dangerous the real warrior underneath it had been. When the news reached him, his own men had to hold him back, afraid of what his grief might drive him toward. What followed wasn't sadness anymore. It was the most dangerous force in the ancient world, fully unleashed. His mother returned with new armor, engraved with the entire human world, farms, festivals, everything ordinary he was about to give up for good. He put it on and went looking for his friend's killer. What followed was a rout, not a battle. Entire companies fell back before him. He took young captives back to camp, not as prisoners, but surrendered entirely at his friend's funeral, a brutal custom of the era that even his own allies found hard to watch. Every enemy soldier fled behind the walls except one, who was chased 3 full laps around the city before a trick finally forced him to turn and fight. He tried, at the last moment, to strike a bargain for his body to be returned home. There would be no bargain. He fell facing his killer, and with his dying words, foretold exactly how that killer's own story would end. What happened to that body afterward was grief turned into something closer to desecration. Dragged behind a chariot for 12 straight days, while a ghost appeared each night, begging for a proper farewell and one final wish, that their ashes be mixed together when the time came. Then came the moment that flips the whole story over. On the 12th night, an old man walked alone into the enemy camp and knelt before the very hands that had killed his son, asking simply for the body back. He spoke of his own age, his own waiting, the son who'd never walk through his door again. For the first time in the entire story, the warrior didn't weep from rage. He wept from recognition of his own father, waiting at home, who he'd chosen never to see again. He returned the body. He agreed to a truce, and that, notably, is where the original poem actually ends, not with his death, but with 2 enemies grieving together over everything the war had already cost them. He hadn't died yet. New allies arrived to help the defenders, and he cut through all of them, including a warrior queen whose face reportedly haunted him the moment her helmet came off. Riding that momentum, he charged the very gate his enemy had named with his dying breath. The prince whose choices had started the entire war drew a bow. In the version everyone knows, the arrow found a magic weak spot on his heel. In the version written first, there was no weak spot to find. He was simply mortal, and he'd chosen this ending for himself before he was old enough to shave. They mourned him for 17 days, his remains mixed with his friends, exactly as promised. His armor was offered to whichever surviving Greek was judged the best warrior left, and the man who lost that judgment did not survive the shame that followed. The most devastating line comes later, when a living visitor reaches the land of the dead and finds him there, tries to comfort him. "You're a king even here. Your name will outlive everyone." He cuts it off immediately. He would rather be a nobody, working someone else's field, alive, than rule over every soul who has ever died. He got exactly what he chose as a teenager, and from the one place fame can no longer reach him, he'd give every bit of it back for a single, ordinary, forgotten day of simply being alive. The lesson underneath a 3,000-year-old story hasn't changed. The thing you're willing to give up everything for might not have been worth what it cost. He found that out. He just found it out too late for it to matter. If stories history tells differently than we remember them are the kind of thing you want to keep uncovering, stay close. There's a lot more still buried.